Hi everyone, my name is Alex Smeniotis and I'm joined by Paul Verrico and Sophie Parkin from Evershed Sutherland's Environmental Health and Safety team. Today we're branching out on a new topic to understand more about tree safety and gain insights into typical questions they are asked as lawyers on compliance in this area and enforcement. Now before we get started, Paul, Sophie, tell us a little bit about why you're the people to discuss this topic, and I might start with you, Paul.
Yeah, it's interesting because as you know, Alex, and from previous podcasts, we advise across all sorts of compliance topics to the the biggest 250 companies in the world. And you'd expect matters such as process safety, psychological safety. We've talked about fire on previous podcasts as being the real cause of concern for organisations. But what's really interesting is that tree safety is an area that is actually quite high on the concern list for our clients.
Yeah, and I think the reason for that is that recently there's been quite a few high-profile cases where members of the public have died or suffered very serious injuries as a result of collapsing trees. So we're often called upon to provide advice in this area. And unfortunately, in these cases, it tends to be children that are the victims, so they become much more high-profile.
And Alex, you'll also recall that when we were talking about the kind of cases that kind of get the public ire, sometimes if it's a middle-aged worker in a job that no one's really that bothered about, it doesn't attract the public attention. Whereas when it's something as tragic and hideous as a child being struck by a falling tree in a school playground, for instance, then that does get media attention. And therefore, that also causes organisations to be concerned. And it works obviously across other sectors than just purely commercial, large organisations, local government, schools, universities, really big concerns.
So given the depth and breadth of all the different industries that may impact, what are the risks involved in managing trees? And I might throw that to you, Sophie.
Yeah, sure. So any duty holder that's in control of a physical area that has trees on it, there's going to be a potential risk that a tree might collapse or a branch might fall from it and cause injuries, death, or also damage to properties. And there's many reasons that a tree might collapse. Trees can rot from sort of common fungus that they can get, or it can be a result of extreme weather conditions causing landslips, wind pulling trees over. And, you know, in the UK at the moment, we are experiencing lots more extreme weather events, which can cause these things to happen.
And in the cases that you've kind of just touched on, what's been the root cause of these issues?
In some of the cases that I just mentioned, the trees involved in those instances had likely been decaying for many, many years without any sort of intervention by the duty holders. And it's that lack of intervention over a long period of time that's likely to have factored into the regulator's decision to prosecute in the first place. It'd also be an aggravating feature of the case and the sentencing exercise as well, because it's evidence of individuals being exposed to a risk over a long period of time. So, you know, you could see how a court would look at a case and think, well, you know, this rotting tree has been in position for 3 years. So there's a potential that every single person that's walked past that tree over those 3 years could have been exposed to risk, and it was actually an incident that was waiting to happen.
So are these incidents involving trees, are they common or not?
In fact, they're actually not. So if you look at the HSE statistics, and they do gather statistics on these things, they estimate that on average, around 5 or 6 people per year are killed in the UK by falling trees or branches. And it's only around about 3 of those that happen in public spaces. So the other 2 or 3 will be in workplace settings. And although that might sound like quite a lot, when you compare those statistics to other statistics of fatal accidents that the HSE collects in particular industries or incident scenarios like working at height or accidents involving workplace transport, for example, the numbers are comparably low. For that reason, the risk of trees is not deemed to be what the HSE call a proactive priority, because they see the risk as being so low. And what that means is that the regulators don't carry out proactive inspections in relation to tree safety, whereas in other situations, they'll often carry out proactive inspections for specific health and safety risks. So just looking at some of the sort of recent examples of that, the HSE have ran a recent campaign on targeting workplaces where there may be exposure to asbestos or dust. So they'll identify those organisations and they'll proactively go in and inspect them. They don't do that in relation to tree safety. But what that doesn't mean is that they don't take it seriously. When incidents do happen, they're investigated and prosecutions do occur. And it's also something to remember that if you're subject to a regulatory proactive inspection in another area, they may notice an issue with tree safety as part of that wider inspection as well.
So, given all that, what are the duty holders required to do to comply with the law in relation to tree safety?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because even whichever jurisdiction you're in, they're based on similar principles. So if you look at Australia or the UK, then there is a duty to do all that's reasonably practicable to ensure that people are not exposed to risk to their health and safety, and that would extend to whether they're employees rather, or members of the public. And there's similar kinds of duties across Europe, and to some extent in America. But it's that general duty to do all that's reasonably practicable that's kind of paramount.
So, what would doing all that is reasonably practical involve, Paul?
It's the $1 million question. As a lawyer, I'll give you my lawyer's answer to most things, Alex, which is it depends. And that is the lawyer's favourite answer when asked that question. What it doesn't say is that you've got to risk assess every tree. It doesn't say you've got to inspect every tree. But it does mean that you've got to take a balanced approach to risk management, and you're expected to decide what to do based upon what's reasonable in the circumstances. Would it be helpful if I kind of gave a couple of examples in that, Alex?
Of course.
So if, for instance, you are a network operator of a transport system, so suppose you're a tram line or a train line operator, you would be expected to risk assess every tree that could fall onto a main line and which could disrupt, cause electrocution, kill people as a result of that. So that duty would be very different to, for instance, a tree which might be in another part of your demise in a wood which you own next to a railway or a tramway. So it would be a different duty, even though you own thousands of trees, to ones that could affect people in a real way. If you're a school and you've got 10 trees and your biggest risk is you've got these trees that are grown in the 60s or 70s and they're all now 30 meters tall, it might be that you have to risk assess every tree because you've got a real risk of people being struck by trees. That's different to other landowners or people who are renting properties. So it means that you've got to think about the land you control. In kind of broad brush principles, if you're trying to do a policy on it, you would say you've got to be aware of the physical nature of the land you control and where there could be risks from trees. And if you've got public spaces, so public footpaths, car parks, pavements, you're going to have to think about that. And then there's also the bit around kind of near misses. So if you've got a row of trees, there's a storm, one of them comes over, one of them loses some branches, you're probably going to want to be looking at other trees that you've got in the same area, see where they've been affected by the same kinds of issues.
So what are the practical steps organizations can take to control the risk?
There's no surprises in what I'm going to say, which is think about trees that have certain characteristics. So ash, for instance, may have a disease. Silver birch is sometimes prone to a disease. So if you're aware that there is a problem with trees in an area, to think about it. We always talk about inspections at a regular interval, and that's a typical lawyer's answer. Again, what's regular? It depends on risk. 1 year, 3 years, 5 years are all intervals that I've seen organisations use. And then there's that piece, as I've just mentioned, about adverse weather events. So if there's been a storm, if you know that there's been issues and it's been on national radio or news, it'd be important to have a look at it. And obviously, the final point is, if you are on notice because people who work for you or members of the public are calling in telling you you've got a problem, you need to do something about it. And regulators around the world and civil courts around the world take a pretty dim view if a duty holder is made aware that there's a problem and then they do very little about it and then something really bad occurs. And that's right as well, really, because if you've got the power to put it right, you really should.
So you've just touched on regulators, the law. So I just might pivot into enforcement, if that's okay. And I might throw this question to you, Sophie. So in terms of enforcement, who's the enforcing authority and what powers do they have?
It can be the HSE or the local authority. It just depends where the incident took place and which regulator has jurisdiction. In terms of the enforcement options that they have, these are really wide ranging, and they can range from sort of an informal warning through to the service of enforcement notices where it's alleged that there's been a breach of the legislation, and then ultimately the most serious enforcement action is a prosecution. And as I mentioned before, there have been several prosecutions in this area in recent history that have really caught the headlines. Enforcement action is public, so it happens publicly in courts, and also regulators keep records of these things on enforcement databases. So the fact of an enforcement notice or a prosecution is kind of enshrined on a publicly accessible database for many, many years afterwards. So it's more than just the legal consequences, it's the commercial and the reputational consequences as well. Inspectors for both local authorities and the HSE, they have quite wide-ranging powers under the Health and Safety at Work Act, and it means that they can do things that actually go wider than police officers have. They can enter premises, they can inspect documents, they can require witnesses to provide evidence, and they can also preserve a scene as well. So really wide-ranging powers and enforcement options that they have.
Very, very interesting and clearly a serious matter. And I guess aspects of that may include sanctions as well. So, Paul, I might ask you, what are the sanctions involved if a company or persons are prosecuted?
Well, there's the UK angle. So Sophie talked about the HSE and the local authority. In Australia, because I know we've obviously got an Australian audience, it's the same principles, and in New South Wales, the prosecutions have tended to be of incidents involving lumberjacks and tree processors rather than falling trees. So that's slightly divergent, but it's the same principles. So the principles are, it's a fine in the UK. It's more likely to be criminal liability on an individual in Australia, but it's based on the turnover of the organisation. And then there's a matrix, and the matrix takes into account the culpability of the organisation, which means how bad was the offending? Was it really bad, so they didn't follow any noted health and safety standards? Or was it the case that they had standards that they didn't follow on a particular occasion? What was the extent of the harm that was risked? And then the crucial bit in relation to trees is how many people were put at risk. So if you're a local authority with trees near a road and you might have 50,000 people going down that road on the way to school or work, that is a magnifier. It is going to cause the size of your fine to go up. And then there is the what harm actually happened category. In the UK, kind of examples, 2021, Staffordshire Council fined £300,000 when a dog walker died when a tree fell on a footpath. Last year, Newcastle Council fined £280,000 when a 6-year-old died at a park. So those are kind of the local authority kind of things. And there's an argument in the UK that when it's a local authority, a government organisation that gets fined effectively, so recycling the public money, and the people who've lost a loved one in effect end up paying the fine because it comes out of their taxes. So there's always been that kind of recycling argument. One of the larger organisations in the UK is Bupa, a care home and private medical company. They were fined £400,000 when an 8-year-old was crushed by a falling tree. So those are the kinds of numbers. In New South Wales, a tree removal company fined 2 million Australian over the death of a worker when a defective wood chipping machine was involved. So the penalties are sufficiently sizable for it to be noteworthy. And of course, they're always things that people like you and I can Google or suck our teeth over in kind of a salutary lesson.
It really is a massive topic, and I know we spoke about that, relatively there's not that many common incidences, but they are really serious in nature and something we, I guess, as a society need to be conscious of, and it's really, really important, and we can talk about this for hours, but I'm conscious of time, so we may need to wrap up with some final remarks. So Paul, I might ask you first, do you have any final remarks in relation to this topic?
Yeah, I guess the thing is that these are the cases that have tragedy written all over them, don't they? And so if we kind of put aside the legal bit and we come back to our duties as humans, managers, people with control of premises, I think it's important to understand where exposure might be happening and to reflect on the fact that the consequences of getting it wrong are really serious and potentially affect people who are really vulnerable. And so ethically, there is a duty on people who control premises, so employ people, to have a real feel for all of their hazards. And I've got to say that's got to extend to natural organisms that if they blow over can have such extreme consequences.
And Sophie, I might throw to you any final remarks.
Yeah, I guess it's just about stepping back and considering the premises as a very first step and deciding if you need to put in place any further control measures or precautions. If you do decide that there are hazards that require controlling, carrying out a risk assessment is going to be the natural first step in determining what control measures are required. There's also lots of really good free resources available online. So, for example, the UK National Tree Safety Group website has lots of free available resource, example risk assessments, for example, which can be really, really helpful.
Excellent. Thank you. So, look, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. It was very informative, and I'm very much looking forward to doing it again. Thank you, Sophie. Thank you, Paul.
Good to see you.
Thank you.